David Carter had already reached the parking lot when he heard the smallest voice. "Mister?" He didn't turn at first. The grocery bags hanging from his hands were heavy, his shoulders ached after another 12-hour shift at the warehouse, and all he wanted was to get home before the frozen food melted. "Mister?" This time the voice came closer. He looked over his shoulder. 4 little girls stood together near the shopping carts. The oldest couldn't have been more than 10. The youngest looked barely 5. Their clothes were clean but worn. Their matching backpacks rested at their feet, and each of them stared at David with wide, uncertain eyes. The smallest girl slowly stepped forward. Then she pointed at the faded tattoo on David's left forearm. Her tiny lips trembled. "Our mom has your tattoo." Everything inside David stopped. The grocery bags slipped from his fingers and crashed onto the pavement. Milk rolled across the parking lot. A loaf of bread landed upside down. But David didn't notice. His eyes remained locked on the little girl. "What? What did you just say?" she swallowed. "Our mommy has the same bird." David looked down at the tattoo he hadn't truly looked at in years, a small blue swallow flying above a thin compass. The colors had faded, the edges had blurred with time, but there was no mistaking it. Nobody had this tattoo, not exactly like this, because it had never come from a tattoo shop. His late wife Emma had drawn it herself on a rainy Sunday afternoon 12 years earlier. She had laughed the whole time, insisting that if they ever got separated in a crowd, all she had to do was look for the stubborn man with the flying bird. Only 2 people had ever worn that design, Emma and David. His throat tightened. Where is your mother?" Before any of the girls could answer, an older woman hurried across the parking lot. "There you girls are." She stopped the moment she noticed David. Her smile disappeared. The girls immediately picked up their backpacks. "Grandma," the oldest whispered softly, "we were just talking to him." The woman gently placed herself between the girls and David. "I'm sorry if they bothered you." David barely heard her. "They said their mother has this tattoo." The grandmother's face turned pale. For one long second, nobody moved. The parking lot noises faded into silence. Cars passed. Shopping carts rattled. Someone laughed in the distance. But inside that tiny circle, time stood perfectly still. Finally, the older woman sighed. "They shouldn't have said anything." David's heart began pounding. "What do you mean?" She looked toward the girls. "Go wait in the car." The oldest hesitated. "But Grandma, please." The 4 sisters quietly walked away. Each of them glanced back at David before climbing into an aging blue minivan parked several spaces away. The grandmother watched until the doors closed. Only then did she turn back toward him. "How long have you had that tattoo?" 12 years. Her eyes widened. 12. David nodded slowly. "My wife designed it herself." The woman covered her mouth, almost as if she had been afraid of hearing exactly those words. "My daughter," she whispered, "has had the same tattoo for about 11 years. David felt the air leave his lungs. "That's impossible." "I know. My wife died 9 years ago." "I know," David blinked. "You know." The woman looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "I know because I've seen your picture before." His heartbeat became painfully loud. "My picture," she nodded, "in an old wooden box." David stared at her. "What box?" She closed her eyes for a moment. "The one my daughter has kept hidden for years." A cold chill crawled slowly down David's spine. Inside that box, according to this stranger, were photographs of him. The question hit him before he could stop it. "Who is your daughter?" The grandmother didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the van where the 4 little girls waited quietly through the window. Then she whispered something so softly that David almost missed it. "Someone who has spent 11 years believing she should never meet you." David stood frozen. Nothing made sense anymore. His wife had died. He had buried her. He had mourned her for nearly a decade. He had never remarried, never even dated. His entire world had become work, quiet evenings, and memories that hurt a little less with each passing year. Yet somewhere in this city, a woman he had never met supposedly carried Emma's hand-drawn tattoo, kept old photographs of him, and had forbidden herself from ever speaking to him. The oldest girl suddenly rolled down the van's window. She smiled sadly. Then she called out just loudly enough for David to hear. "Mom cried when she saw your picture last week." David's knees nearly gave out. For the first time since Emma's funeral, he wasn't sure whether the past had truly stayed buried, or whether it had just found its way back to him in the form of 4 little girls who somehow knew the story written forever on his arm. David stood motionless long after the blue minivan disappeared from the parking lot. The cold evening breeze brushed against his face, but he barely felt it. His mind replayed every word the girls had spoken. "Our mom has your tattoo. Mom cried when she saw your picture." None of it made sense. By the time he reached his small house, the frozen groceries had already begun to thaw. He placed them on the kitchen counter without unpacking them. The house was as quiet as it had been every evening for the past 9 years. Emma's favorite coffee mug still sat on the highest shelf. The old piano by the living room window hadn't been touched since the day she died. Even the family photo above the fireplace remained exactly where he'd left it, its colors slowly fading with time. David sat in his worn armchair and rubbed his face. He wasn't the kind of man who believed in impossible stories. There had to be an explanation, a coincidence, a misunderstanding, yet one detail refused to leave his thoughts: the tattoo. It wasn't something anyone could accidentally copy. Emma had designed it on a yellow notepad one rainy afternoon. The swallow represented freedom. The compass represented finding home. Inside the compass, almost too small to notice, Emma had hidden one tiny heart. Only David knew where it was. Even most tattoo artists would have missed it. He slowly rolled up his sleeve. The faded ink looked older now than he remembered. His fingers traced the tiny heart. "If someone really has this," he whispered, "they didn't copy it from the internet." The next morning, David couldn't concentrate at work. Boxes slipped from his hands. His supervisor asked twice if he was feeling sick. "I didn't sleep much," David replied. That was true. He hadn't slept at all. Every break, he found himself looking toward the parking lot outside the warehouse, half expecting those 4 little girls to appear again. They never did. By lunchtime, curiosity became stronger than fear. He opened the old wooden chest in his bedroom. Inside were the few things he had never been able to throw away: Emma's wedding ring, a birthday card she had written, hospital papers, their honeymoon photographs, and a leather journal. David hesitated before opening it. Emma had loved sketching: flowers, birds, tiny houses, funny cartoons she'd leave inside his lunchbox. Near the middle of the journal, he found it, the original drawing, a small blue swallow flying above a compass, exactly like the tattoo. Below it, Emma had written in messy handwriting, "No matter where life takes us, we'll always find our way home." David smiled sadly. Then something unexpected happened. A folded piece of paper slipped from between the pages. He frowned. He had never noticed it before. Carefully unfolding it, he realized it wasn't in Emma's handwriting. Someone else had written it, only 3 short lines. "Thank you for saving my life. One day I'll repay this kindness." David stared at the signature, just one letter. He searched his memory. Nothing. Emma had never mentioned anyone named L. He flipped through the journal again. Near the back, tucked between 2 sketches, he found another surprise: a photograph. Emma stood smiling beside a teenage girl, maybe 16, dark hair, gentle eyes. The girl's arm was wrapped around Emma's shoulders. On the back of the picture, Emma had written, "Lucy finally smiled today." David froze. Lucy. Who was Lucy? Why had Emma never mentioned her? That evening, David drove back to the same grocery store. He told himself he was only there to buy milk. Deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He parked in the same spot, waited, watched families come and go. An hour passed. Nothing. Then, just as the sun dipped below the buildings, the familiar blue minivan pulled into the lot. David's pulse quickened. The 4 little girls climbed out first. The oldest immediately spotted him. She whispered something to her sisters. Instead of running away, they smiled. The youngest waved excitedly. "Hi, Mr. Tattoo." David couldn't help smiling. Before he could answer, the grandmother stepped out of the driver's seat. She looked exhausted. As though she hadn't slept either, she walked slowly toward him. "I hoped you wouldn't come back." "I had to," she nodded. "I understand." David spoke gently. "I don't want to scare anyone. I just need answers." The older woman looked toward the girls who were pretending to race shopping carts while secretly watching the conversation. "They've been asking about you since yesterday." David swallowed. "What have you told them?" "The truth." "What truth?" "That sometimes good people get separated by life." David looked down. "I've never met your daughter." "I know." "Then why does she have my picture?" The woman hesitated. Her hands trembled. Finally, she reached into her purse. From inside, she removed an old photograph. Its corners were bent. The colors had faded. She handed it to David. His hands began shaking before he even looked at it. It was him, Emma, and the same teenage girl from the journal. All three were smiling outside what looked like a hospital. David whispered, "This girl is your daughter." The grandmother nodded. "Lucy." David looked back at the picture. Memory slowly stirred, not clearly, just fragments. A hospital hallway, Emma carrying flowers, a frightened teenage girl sitting alone. Had he seen her? Maybe, only once, years ago. The grandmother spoke softly. "Emma volunteered every Saturday at St. Mary's Children's Hospital." David's eyes widened. Of course she had. He remembered dropping her off dozens of times. She always stayed for hours, reading stories, drawing pictures, playing piano for sick children. But David almost never went inside. He usually waited in the parking lot or picked her up afterward. "I thought she only worked with children," he said. "Mostly." The grandmother smiled sadly. Sometimes there were teenagers who had nowhere else to go. David stared at Lucy's younger face in the photograph. "She was one of them?" The woman nodded. "Lucy had cancer." David's heart sank. Emma became the first person who treated her like she wasn't just another patient. The grandmother's voice began to shake. "She brought sketchbooks, colored pencils, books, and one rainy afternoon, they designed matching tattoos together." David felt every hair on his arm stand up. "No." The grandmother slowly nodded. "Emma never copied your tattoo. She gave Lucy the same design." David couldn't breathe. Emma had created a third tattoo, not for romance, not for love, but for hope. The grandmother wiped away a tear. She told Lucy, "Whenever you feel lost, this little bird will remind you that someone believes you'll find your way home." David closed his eyes. That sounded exactly like Emma. Exactly the same kindness, the same heart. But one question still remained. A question that suddenly felt even heavier than before. "If Lucy knew Emma," he asked quietly, "why has she spent 11 years hiding from me?" The grandmother looked toward the little girls. All four were laughing together now, happy, safe, completely unaware that one answer was about to change everything. The older woman's lips trembled. "Because," she whispered, "before Emma died, she made Lucy promise never to tell you the truth." David felt the world tilt beneath his feet. David couldn't speak. The sounds of the grocery store faded again. Shopping carts rolled past. Car doors slammed. Children laughed somewhere across the parking lot. But all David could hear was one sentence. "Before Emma died, she made Lucy promise never to tell you the truth." He looked at the grandmother, searching for any sign that she might be mistaken. "There has to be some misunderstanding. I wish there were. Emma would never keep something like this from me." The older woman nodded slowly. "Believed the same thing, until Lucy finally told me everything." David's voice grew quieter. "Tell me." The grandmother looked toward the minivan. The four little girls had finished playing and were now sitting inside, drawing pictures with crayons. "They're waiting for us." David glanced at the children. "They deserve their grandmother. And you deserve the truth." She hesitated before speaking again. "Tomorrow, my house. I'll ask Lucy to come." David swallowed. "Will she?" The older woman smiled sadly. "I honestly don't know." That night felt longer than any David could remember. He didn't watch television. He didn't eat dinner. Instead, he opened every photo album Emma had ever kept. Thousands of memories filled those pages: birthday parties, camping trips, Christmas mornings, picnics, neighborhood cookouts, volunteer events. Then, he noticed something strange. Emma appeared in dozens of hospital photographs. Children surrounded her, doctors smiled beside her. Volunteers stood together. But every single time, one teenage girl seemed to be standing somewhere nearby. Sometimes in the background, sometimes beside Emma. Sometimes almost hidden behind a doorway, dark hair, gentle smile, Lucy. How had he never noticed her before? He turned another page, another picture. Emma handing Lucy a birthday cupcake. Another, the two of them laughing over a sketchbook. Another, Lucy holding a tiny blue stuffed bird. David's chest tightened. Emma hadn't simply known this girl. She had loved her, not as a daughter, not as family, but as someone she had refused to let face the world alone. He whispered into the empty room, "Why didn't you tell me?" Only silence answered. The next afternoon, David drove across town. The grandmother's house was small but warm. Bright flowers filled the front yard. Wind chimes sang softly beneath the porch roof. Children's bicycles rested near the fence. Everything about the place felt peaceful, yet David's heartbeat refused to slow. The front door opened before he reached it. The grandmother greeted him with a nervous smile. "Come in." Inside, the smell of fresh bread filled the house. Crayon drawings covered one wall, family photographs lined another. David noticed something almost immediately. There wasn't a single photograph of the girl's father, only Lucy, the girls, and their grandmother. His eyes quietly asked the question. The older woman answered before he could speak. "My son-in-law passed away 3 years ago." David lowered his head. "I'm sorry." "So are we." The room became quiet. Then 4 little feet came running down the hallway. "Mr. Tattoo?" The youngest girl threw her arms around David's waist before anyone could stop her. Her sisters giggled. The oldest looked embarrassed. "Grace," their grandmother laughed. "You have to ask before hugging people." Grace looked up at David. "Is it okay?" David smiled for the first time in days. "It's okay." The little girl squeezed him tighter. "You look sad." Children notice things adults often missed. "I'm just thinking." "My mommy says thinking makes people tired." David chuckled softly. "She's probably right." Grace reached into her pocket. "I drew something." She handed him a folded piece of paper. David unfolded it carefully. It was a child's drawing, 5 little girls, 1 mommy, 1 man standing beside them. Above everyone flew a tiny blue bird. At the top, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "Families find each other." David felt his throat tighten. "Did your mom help you draw this?" Grace nodded proudly. "She said birds always know where home is." David closed his eyes for a second. Emma used to say exactly the same thing, exactly. The front door suddenly opened. Every sound inside the house disappeared. Footsteps echoed softly across the hallway. David looked up. A woman stood frozen near the entrance. She looked no older than her early 30s. Dark brown hair rested against her shoulders. Her eyes immediately found the tattoo on David's arm. She didn't speak. Neither did David. The little girls looked between them. "Mom," Grace whispered. Lucy still couldn't move. For 11 years she had imagined this moment, in her dreams, in her nightmares, in every quiet moment after putting her daughters to bed. She had rehearsed 1,000 different conversations. Not one of them prepared her for reality. David finally broke the silence. "Lucy," a tear rolled down her cheek. "You remembered my name. I saw Emma's journal." Lucy looked away. "She kept it." David nodded. "And she kept your picture." Lucy slowly smiled through tears. "She promised she would." The grandmother quietly gathered the 4 girls. "Let's give them a few minutes." The children followed her into the backyard, though Grace looked back 3 different times. As soon as the door closed, the silence returned. David spoke first. "I've spent 2 days trying to understand." "I know. I still don't." Lucy nodded. "You deserve answers." "Then please." Her hands shook as she removed her light sweater on her left forearm. David finally saw it, the swallow, the compass, the tiny hidden heart, exactly where Emma had placed it. His eyes filled with tears. "It's real." Lucy looked down at it gently. "I've never covered it. You've had this all these years. Every day." David could barely whisper. "Emma gave it to you?" Lucy smiled sadly. "She gave me far more than a tattoo." They sat across from one another at the kitchen table. Neither touched the tea that had grown cold. Lucy folded her hands together. When I was 16, I didn't want to fight anymore. David listened without interrupting. My cancer treatments weren't working. I'd lost my hair. My friends stopped visiting. My father had already left. My mom worked 3 jobs just to keep me alive. Her voice trembled. I stopped believing I had a future. David remembered Emma coming home exhausted from the hospital. She had cried sometimes. He never knew why. Lucy continued. Then one Saturday, Emma walked into my room carrying colored pencils. David smiled through tears. That sounds like her. I told her to leave. What did she do? Lucy laughed softly. She ignored me for the first time. David laughed too. That also sounded exactly like Emma. Every week she came back. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we didn't. Sometimes she'd just sit there drawing birds while I stared out the window. Lucy looked toward her tattoo. One afternoon she asked me, if you could leave this hospital tomorrow, where would you go? I told her. Home, Emma smiled and said, then let's give you something that always remembers the way. Lucy gently touched the faded bird on her arm. That's the day we got the tattoos. David couldn't stop the tears anymore. It felt as though Emma was sitting in the room with them, still changing lives. Still healing broken hearts, even after all these years, but one mystery still remained. David looked into Lucy's eyes. If she loved you that much, why did she make you disappear from my life? Lucy closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were filled with heartbreak. Because, she whispered, the last promise I ever made to Emma was the hardest promise anyone has ever asked me to keep. Lucy sat silently for several seconds, her fingers wrapped around the untouched cup of tea. David didn't interrupt. He had learned something about grief after losing Emma. Some memories refused to come out unless they were given time. Finally, Lucy took a slow breath. It happened 2 weeks before Emma died. David's chest tightened. Emma had been killed by a drunk driver while driving home from the hospital, at least. That was the story he had believed for 9 years. Lucy looked down. She asked me to meet her at the hospital garden. I remember that day, David whispered. She told me she was meeting a patient who had finally finished treatment. Lucy nodded. I had just been told I was cancer-free. For the first time, a small smile appeared on her face. Emma cried harder than I did. David smiled through his tears. That sounds exactly like her. Lucy laughed softly. She hugged every nurse she could find. Then the smile slowly disappeared. We sat on a bench for almost 2 hours. What did you talk about? Life, dreams, what I wanted to become. And, Lucy hesitated, what would happen if she wasn't around anymore? David frowned. Emma said that? Lucy nodded. She told me something she had never told anyone else. David's heart pounded. What? Lucy slowly looked into his eyes. She said she had been having a strange feeling for weeks. A feeling that time was running out. David shook his head. Emma never believed in things like that. I know. That's why it frightened me. Lucy reached into her purse. I've carried this for 11 years. She carefully removed a small white envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. The edges were worn from being opened and closed countless times. Across the front, written in Emma's familiar handwriting, were 4 simple words, for David, someday. David's hands immediately began shaking. You have a letter from Emma? Lucy nodded. She made me promise I wouldn't give it to you. Why? Because she said you wouldn't be ready. David stared at the envelope as if it might disappear. For 11 years, I tried to break my promise so many times. Lucy looked away, especially after my husband died. I wanted to call you. I wanted to tell you everything. But every time, I remembered the look on Emma's face. David whispered, what did she say? Lucy closed her eyes. She held my hands and said, David has a beautiful heart, but grief will become his prison if he starts living for the past instead of the future. Tears rolled down David's face. That was Emma, always thinking about someone else, even while facing her own fears. Lucy continued. She made me promise that I would only find you when life did it for us. David looked confused. What does that mean? She said. If fate ever puts David in your path without either of you searching, That's when you'll know it's finally time. David let out a slow breath. The grocery store, Lucy nodded. Neither of us planned it. The girls simply saw your tattoo, and everything changed. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, David looked at the envelope again. I don't know if I can open it. Lucy smiled gently. I think Emma knew you'd say that. Why? Because she told me one more thing. What? David always needs someone to tell him it's okay. David laughed through his tears. She wasn't wrong. Lucy slowly placed the letter into his hands. It's okay. His fingers trembled as he broke the seal. Inside was a single folded page. Emma's handwriting filled every line. David could almost hear her voice. My stubborn bird, if you're reading this, then life has surprised you again. It usually does. First, don't be angry with Lucy. Everything she has done was because I asked her to. She kept a promise that was far too heavy for someone so young. Second, if you're still wearing our little bird, thank you. I hope it reminded you that love doesn't disappear just because someone does. You once asked me why I spent so much time at the hospital. The truth is simple. Every lonely child I met reminded me how quickly life can change. Love should never wait until tomorrow. Lucy was one of the bravest people I've ever known. She survived because she finally believed her story wasn't over. Please don't let yours end with mine. If you ever meet again, be kind to each other. Neither of you deserved the pain life gave you. And one last thing. Birds don't spend their lives flying back to empty nests. They build new ones. Promise me you'll keep living. Love always. Emma. David couldn't see the last few words through his tears. The paper shook in his hands. For 9 years, he had believed that loving Emma meant refusing to move forward. Now her own words were asking him to do the opposite. Lucy quietly wiped her eyes. I've read that letter hundreds of times. David looked up. You read it, she nodded. I wasn't supposed to, but after Emma died, I needed to hear her voice too. David folded the letter carefully. Instead of putting it back into the envelope, he pressed it gently against his heart. Thank you, Lucy whispered. I've waited 11 years to hear you say that. Just then the back door burst open. The 4 little girls came running inside, laughing. Mom, Grace shouted. We made cookies. The youngest raced toward Lucy, then suddenly stopped in front of David. She tilted her head. Are you crying? David smiled. A little. Grace reached into her tiny pocket. She pulled out a wrinkled tissue. My teacher says crying is okay. David accepted it with a smile. Your teacher is very smart. Grace nodded proudly. I know. Then she did something that surprised everyone. She slipped her small hand into David's. You don't have to be lonely anymore. The room became completely silent. Lucy looked at her daughter. The grandmother quietly wiped away another tear from the kitchen doorway. David looked down at the little hand holding his. For years, his house had been silent. His dinner table had only one chair. His birthday cakes had only one candle. He had convinced himself that was loyalty. But now, 4 little girls had filled that silence with laughter in less than an hour. Grace smiled up at him. Mom says families find each other when they stop looking. David looked across the room at Lucy. She smiled through tears. I may have said that once, he nodded slowly. No, looking at the little blue bird tattoo on both their arms, he whispered, I think Emma did. The house felt different after that afternoon, not because anything extraordinary had happened, but because something inside David had quietly begun to heal. For the first time in 9 years, he didn't rush home to an empty house. Instead, he stayed for dinner. Grace insisted he sit beside her. The twins argued over who got to show him their school drawings first. The oldest, Hannah, carefully set the table, making sure there was one more plate than usual. David noticed it immediately. Did you always set 5 plates? He asked. Hannah smiled shyly. No. Then why tonight? The 10-year-old shrugged. It just felt right. David couldn't answer. Children had a way of saying the simplest things with the greatest wisdom. Over the next few weeks, David became a familiar face at the little house with the flower garden. Sometimes he helped fix a broken fence. Sometimes he repaired bicycles. Other times he simply sat on the porch while the girls chased butterflies across the yard. He never tried to replace anyone. The girls already had a father they loved and missed. He respected that. Instead, he became something else. Someone who listened, someone who showed up, someone who never broke a promise. One Saturday morning, Grace ran outside carrying a small toolbox almost as big as she was. "Mr. David, what is it?" "My birdhouse fell down," David laughed. "Then we'd better rescue it." For the next hour, they worked together. Grace handed him nails that were too small, a hammer that was upside down, and endless advice she had completely invented. "No, no," she said seriously. "Birds like crooked houses." "They do." "Of course. Who told you that?" She smiled proudly. "I did." David laughed harder than he had in years. Lucy watched quietly from the kitchen window. Her mother walked beside her. "I haven't seen you smile like that since before Michael died." Lucy looked at David and the girls. "I forgot what hope looked like." Her mother squeezed her hand. "No, you simply forgot it could come back." Months passed. Autumn painted the trees gold. The girls started a new school year. David found himself helping with homework, science projects, and school concerts. One evening, Hannah quietly sat beside him on the porch. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." She looked down at her shoes. "Were you scared after your wife died?" David didn't answer immediately. He wanted to tell the truth. "Yes, every day. Worse than scared. I was lost." Hannah nodded slowly. "I think Mom still gets lost sometimes." David looked toward the kitchen window where Lucy was helping the younger girls bake cookies. "So do I," Hannah smiled. "Maybe lost people can help each other." David looked at the thoughtful little girl. "You sound a lot like your mother," she laughed. "Everyone says that." Winter arrived early. One snowy afternoon, David received an unexpected phone call. It was St. Mary's Children's Hospital, the very hospital where Emma had volunteered. A nurse spoke warmly. "Mr. Carter, we're holding our annual Hope Day celebration next month." "I remember. We were wondering," she hesitated. "Would you and Lucy be willing to speak?" David blinked. "Me." "We recently found Emma's volunteer journals. She wrote about both of you." David felt his heart race. "Our patients still read some of her stories. We think they'd love to hear what happened after all these years." David looked across the room. Lucy was helping Grace color another blue bird. He smiled. "I think Emma would have liked that." Hope Day arrived on a bright spring morning. The hospital looked different. New buildings, new gardens, new faces, but one thing hadn't changed. Children still filled the hallways with quiet courage. David and Lucy stood together near the small stage. The four girls sat in the front row beside their grandmother. Nearly 200 families filled the room: doctors, nurses, volunteers, former patients. Before the event began, the hospital director walked onto the stage. She held up an old sketchbook. "Many years ago, one of our volunteers believed that kindness should leave something behind." She opened the sketchbook. Inside were dozens of tiny drawings: birds, flowers, stars, smiling faces. Every child Emma had visited had received one. The audience grew silent. The director continued. "Because of Emma Carter's work, more than 60 former patients returned as volunteers." David's eyes widened. 60. Many became nurses, teachers, parents, counselors. "They often tell us one simple reason." She smiled. "Someone believed in them before they believed in themselves." Lucy quietly wiped away tears. Director looked toward her. "One of those patients is here today." Lucy slowly walked onto the stage. Her voice shook at first. "When I was 16, I believed my story was over." She looked at the audience. "Then one woman sat beside my hospital bed every Saturday. She didn't promise miracles. She didn't promise tomorrow. She simply refused to let me face today alone." Many parents in the audience were already crying. Lucy smiled gently. "Everything good in my life, my daughters, my courage, my hope, started with one stranger carrying colored pencils." The room fell completely silent. Then she turned toward David. "And today, because 4 little girls noticed a tattoo, Emma's kindness found its way home again." David walked onto the stage. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Finally, he rolled up his sleeve. The faded blue swallow appeared once more. Lucy did the same. Two identical birds, two different lives. One extraordinary act of kindness connecting them forever. David looked out across the room. I spent 9 years believing grief was the only way to prove I still loved my wife. He smiled through tears. I was wrong. Love doesn't ask us to stop living. It teaches us how to help others live. The audience stood. One person began clapping, then another. Within seconds, the entire room rose to its feet, not for David, not for Lucy, but for the woman whose kindness had quietly continued changing lives long after she was gone. That evening, after everyone had gone home, David and Lucy stopped by the small cemetery where Emma rested. The girls placed 5 blue flowers beside the headstone. Grace looked up at the sky. "Do you think she can see us?" Lucy smiled softly. "I think love always finds a way." Grace nodded as though that answer made perfect sense. She carefully placed her tiny drawing beside the flowers. It showed 7 people holding hands. Above them, 2 little blue birds flew together toward the sunset. David looked at Emma's name carved into the stone. Then he unfolded the letter one last time. His eyes stopped on the final sentence. Birds don't spend their lives flying back to empty nests. They build new ones for the first time in nearly a decade. Those words no longer felt like permission. They felt like a promise. He folded the letter, slipped it back into his pocket, and looked toward Lucy and the girls. Grace reached for his hand. Without thinking, he took it. The others smiled. Together, they walked away from the cemetery, not leaving Emma behind, but carrying her love forward in every step they took, because the greatest miracles are rarely loud. Sometimes they begin with a faded tattoo, a frightened child, a promise kept for 11 years, and 4 little girls brave enough to say, "Our mom has your tattoo."